The first time I met the boy was on one of those dark, smothering, misty days when I liked to wander along the greenway path that curled through the town. One of those late winter days when the clouds hung low and it seemed like it was raining even when it wasn't. There he was, under the big old oak tree a few yards off the path. He was sitting on a rope swing. Maybe it was a hammock. I had made this rope swing hammock thing myself last summer. I had bought a long line of good quality rope at the local home improvement store, and I had tied it to the end of the rope to a hammer, and I'd thrown it as hard as I could up and over a high branch. This had taken a few tries, and a crowd of kids had gathered around me wondering what I was up to. There were a lot of wild kids in this town. They must have parents somewhere, but you never would see them. Many of these kids had been raised by their grandparents, who were too old and too tired to bother chasing them around all day. I guess their grandparents, or I guess their real parents, hadn't figured that raising a kid would be so difficult. But on most rainy days, nobody usually walked around out here. On a clear, sunny day, there would suddenly be hordes of people popping out of the woodwork. But on these kind of cool, breezy, wet days, there usually wasn't a soul. Except perhaps a few people on the greenway, the regulars. There was Jack, the old alcoholic who wandered around town with a blank stare, his hands shaking, lifeless eyes that had seen far too much sorrow for one lifetime. And then there was Martha, the old hippie fitness geek who was always outside. And then there was me. Walking had become a habit with me. I didn't feel right if I didn't walk each day. And I hated to walk on a treadmill in the gym with everyone glancing over at me to see how I was doing. I just wanted some quiet me time. I didn't much like the other adults in this town. They were all judgmental and gossipy and cruel and cynical. They were very cynical. But I did love the local children. And of course, all the adults assumed that I was some kind of creep. In fact, I had had the police called on me a number of times at first, just for daring to speak to these little children. But finally, I guess they had just started to assume that I was gay or something, and harmless enough. And now they just seem to leave me alone, at least for the most part. I was, after all, one of the few men in this town who didn't have a handgun. Most men in the town had handguns that you would see them hanging off their belts in the local stores. The spot under the tree where my worn-out rope swing was hanging was a big summer hangout now for all the children, the wild children. There wasn't much to do in this town, and word had spread amongst the children about this swing I had made. But like I said, mostly people didn't come out on these kind of days when the weather was bad. So that's why when I first saw the boy out here, I was a bit surprised. I walked up to him slowly with my hands in my pockets. He had a quiet, sad look on his face. And I decided to say something. "Hey, buddy, what are you up to?" I hated to speak with my peers, but I always found it easy to talk to children. The boy looked to me to be about 13 years old, with dark, shaggy hair, and he was wearing a raggedy old Walmart jacket. He just glanced up at me and stared at me for a few moments. It was a bit unnerving, to be honest. He finally broke the awkward silence and he said, "I'm not doing nothing." He was just trying to stay away from his uncle, he said. I pushed him forward a few feet on the swing. Why do you want to stay away from your uncle for? Is your uncle mean? The boy began to smile and he chuckled a bit as I moved the rope around in circles with him in tow. I don't think he was used to so much positive attention. My uncle is as mean as it is possible for anyone to be, the boy said. He ain't a drunk or nothing, he's just obsessed with religion and the end of the world and with guns and stuff like that. He's always shouting at me and hitting me because he says I'm not saved. He says I might have the devil in me even. I had a sudden rush of sadness and pity for the boy. This was indeed a very religious part of the country, the Bible Belt. Even if I used to be one of these people myself. In fact, my father had been a pastor of one of these big churches in town. That's part of why I was now considered such a loser and loner around here. In this town, if you didn't line up right with the church folk, then you didn't stand much of a chance of being successful at much of anything. If word got out that you were unsaved or backslidden, let's just say that you were in big trouble. That's one big reason why I could never get away from here. It was difficult to hold down a job when you had a negative reputation. In fact, I once got fired from a job as a janitor at the local grocery store for no other reason than that some of the local employees had found out some details about me and had decided I wasn't one of the saved gang. I hated that job anyhow. But to see a child facing this kind of judgment nearly brought tears to my eyes. Don't worry, my friend. You don't have the devil in you. The devil doesn't exist anyway, and even if he did, would it make much difference, really? I mean, the devil never was much worse than the guy who's gonna toss everyone to hell, is he? The boy glanced up at me inquisitively with an almost shocked expression. I could tell he was not used to anyone speaking to him like that. Certainly not an adult. You look like an okay guy to me, I said. What's your name? My name's Robin. My mom used to name me that because on the day she came home with me from the hospital, she had found a dead robin on the porch. My dad had shot it with his .22 rifle and he'd left it there. He was kind of young and dumb when he had me. In fact, both of my parents were young and dumb. That's why they shipped me down here to my Uncle Tony. They were just too young and too stupid to deal with me, I guess. I continued to push the rope swing around me in circles with the boy in tow, and he finally began to smile. At least a little bit. My heart was pounding and I was a little bit out of breath. I guess I wasn't in as good shape as I thought. Yeah, I see a lot of kids out here who don't really have parents. I guess these are just tough times, huh? Yeah, these are tough times. In fact, the other day at my school there was a warning about a mass shooter and we all had to hide under our desks for like half an hour. That's terrible, I replied. Yeah. I was pretty intrigued by this little fellow, so I thought I might stick around for a while. I didn't have much of anything else to do. He slid off the swing and he walked down the green hill over to where the little creek meandered along a few yards from the path. A large bird with a long beak, perhaps a heron, was standing in the clear flowing water, and it glanced nervously over to us before focusing its attention back to the fish that were darting around its awkward stilt-like legs. The boy sat down silently upon the grass and then looked up to me and smiled. Isn't it amazing the way they hunt? They're like ninjas or something, aren't they? Slowly stalking around and then suddenly grabbing the fish. I smiled back at him and then replied, Yeah, it's pretty neat, isn't it? We both stood there for a few minutes watching the bird, and then as the boy stood up, the bird suddenly made a nervous movement and flew quickly up the creek, landing gracefully on a distant tree branch. Hey, you want to see this nice place I found the other day? The boy said. Sure, I said, and I followed as he walked across the field over to a damp, dark underside of a large overhead bridge.